Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Child Abduction, Building Collaboration with Other Community Agencies. My name is Jessica Musuer, and I'll be your host. I work as a mental health specialist here at Serving Children and Reaching Families, and I'm excited to be hosting this webinar today. Before I hand the mic over to our speaker, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about this presentation and the webinar platform. First, as an attendee, you will be in listen-only mode and will not be able to verbally communicate during the webinar. Other participant names are not visible to those in listen-only mode. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question for our speaker, please feel free to send it through the questions panel at the bottom of your player. We'll be answering questions at the end of the webinar. Options for computer audio are listed on your screen. While a headset is recommended, you may use your computer microphone and speakers. Telephone audio is an option as well, and those numbers are listed on your screen. Today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session and is accessible through the Serving Children and Reaching Families site as well as on the YouTube site. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Rashida Moore. Rashida holds a license as a mental health counselor and is a Florida qualified supervisor for mental health counselors. She works as a behavioral health consultant, assisting the Department of Children and Families Child Protective Investigation and law enforcement agencies with cases involving mental health and substance abuse issues. She has provided clinical oversight and program consultation across multiple counties. So without any further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming our speaker, Rashida.
Good afternoon, and I just want to say thank you to everyone who's tuned in and joined us for today's webinar. Again, I'm Rashida Moore, and I look forward to speaking with you today. Before we get started, I just want to give a brief overview of some of the things I intend to cover during this webinar. I'll review some statistics as well as new initiatives that can be implemented to help prevent child abductions. I provide some information on some statewide initiatives that have taken place here in the state of Florida and as well as throughout the United States. I'll discuss other issues facing youth at risk, give some signs and symptoms to look for when um, evaluating a person or a potential child abductor. I'll focus on the victim, the impact it has on not only them, but as well as their families, as well as some vicarious trauma issues as professionals, things we face when working with victims and their families. And last but not least, we'll be taught ways to get involved and be a part of a larger mission to help build a coalition of prevention, not only law enforcement officers, but other community agencies as well. So I want to begin with a brief synopsis of a patient and her family or her grandmother that I worked with. I had a teenager that I was working with, providing mental health therapy, and I had an opportunity to also work closely with her grandmother, both of whom were personally affected by a family member who was almost abducted. This occurred in the 1970s when the grandmother's daughter, who is consequently the teenager that I was working with, mother. She was 10 years old, walking to the neighborhood store with an 11-year-old friend in rural Indiana. While they were walking, and this was during the daytime hours, while they were walking to the store, a man jumped out of his vehicle and tried to grab both of them. The 10-year-old was able to get away and run home, while the 11-year-old was unfortunately taken by this man. Once the 10-year-old got home and told her parents about what happened, they immediately contacted law enforcement and Unfortunately, the 3 days later, the 11-year-old's body was found a few miles from the home, a few blocks from the home, rather. And it turned out to be the abductor actually turned out to be a local youth minister in one of the churches in the neighborhood and a very prominent member of the community. So, with that being said, I had to do some grief work with the grandmother because even as she told this story years later, she was still heavily affected by it, tearful, and um, long story, even longer. The 10-year-old, the family had to move and eventually move from the neighborhood in Indiana, and they relocated to Florida because the 10-year-old was ostracized by some members of the community, asking why you couldn't do more, why didn't you do more, and so forth, things like that. And she had some issues of survivor's guilt growing up, which eventually led her to become more promiscuous and turn to a life of substance use and abuse. Um, at when my teenager who was actually my patient, turned 7 years old, she was in the second grade. Um, her mother, who was the 10-year-old victim at the time, was found deceased of a drug overdose. So my teenager that I was working with experienced the trauma based on losing her mother because of what had happened to her, and the grandmother is still having issues with dealing with not only her child almost being abducted, having to cope with the substance use and the mental health issues that were brought on, and the grief and loss of losing a loved one. So that's an up close and personal perspective of my patient, and um, hope it gives you a better insight of why we are here and why we do the things that we do. What is child abduction? In its simplest terms, it's a taking away of a person by force or coercion. We know it as kidnapping or snatched from someone. Um, Child abduction is actually defined as the offense of wrongfully removing a child or wrongfully retaining, detaining, or concealing a child or baby. Abduction is simply defined as taking away a person by persuasion, fraud, or by open force or violence. So, this example I gave, the personal example that I gave, was a child abduction or an attempted child abduction by my patient's family, but the 11-year-old was actually abducted and murdered. There are two types of child abduction. There's the parental abduction and abduction by a stranger. Parental abduction is when a child is taken by another parent. Is usually for the purposes of, well, most of the time is for custody type issues, and the one parent wants to gain an advantage over the other child, the other parent. um, Parental abductions are also known as family child abductions, and which basically means a family member or another relative also took the child. So again, parental abduction is by a parent, a family member, or another relative, whereas abduction by a stranger is just what it says. A stranger takes the child, or an acquaintance or a neighbor or something similar also falls up under abduction by a stranger. The example that I gave um, a few moments ago was an example of a classic abduction by a stranger. And another thing about parental child abductions before I move forward, I work closely with the child welfare system, and we see quite a few cases or even abuse or neglect calls coming to the system where they are just simply trying to build a case for um, them to be able to have more of a right to the child than the other parent. Now, all cases aren't of that nature, but there are quite a few that do fall up under that category, and we have to sometimes just refer them back to civil court or family court, and it's not an issue that's going to be handled by the department if there is truly no abuse or neglect happening. Let's review some child abuse statistics. Every 40 seconds, a child becomes missing or abducted. I'll make that relative to today's training. So we have an hour, a little less than an hour allotted for this webinar. Um, in this hour time or in this allotted time, based on statistics, about 90 children will be abducted or go missing. Family and child abduction is the most common form of abduction in the United States, and almost half of the child abductions are kidnappings by a parent or other relative. We've reviewed that in the previous slide, so I won't harp on that, but I will put a number to that in this hour-long webinar. Of the 90 children, that means that 45 of them will be taken by a parent or another relative. More than 25% of child abductions are by an acquaintance of the child, and less than one quarter of child abductions are by a stranger, with more girls being abducted than boys. So, more than 25% of child abductions are taken by an acquaintance. Let's go back to our 90 children in this webinar training. Of those 90 children, 23 of those will be abductions by an acquaintance. Less than a quarter of the abductions by a stranger. So, of the 90 children, 22 of those will be by a stranger who has no ties to this child at all, with more girls being abducted than boys. Approximately 80% of child abductions by strangers occur within one quarter of a mile or a quarter of a mile from the child's home. And roughly 75% of abduction murders occur within 3 hours after the child goes missing. So when a child is taken, it is best for the best outcomes is to try and locate them before a 3 hour time frame elapses. And usually the search radius needs to be um, within miles or blocks in close proximity to the child's home. The overwhelming majority of non-family child abductions, 80%, are motivated by sexual intentions. And that ties into the other webinars that's being presented through SCARF, the human trafficking and the child exploitation. All of this goes hand in hand. And so, again, 80%, which is a high percentage of these 90 children that I talked about, are going to be taken by, um, for sexual motivations. So that's 75 children, approximately 75 children will be taken for sexual intentions. Right now, I'm going to turn it over for a brief clip to be shown about a Netflix movie. And again, I don't own any rights to this, and this clip is going to be shown just for the purposes of what we're talking about today for education and training.
Mr. Birchhold had such an effervescent, wonderful personality. We became very good friends.
He was so engaged with the kids, too. I mean, he really was fun. And
he could give me a great feeling about myself. I was attracted to him.
Jan Broberg and Robert Berchtold had an unnatural relationship.
I loved him as deeply as I've ever loved anyone.
My brother was always a sexual pervert. He always did like his little girls.
Berchtold said, I want to take Jan out horseback riding. When she didn't come home, I was a little nervous.
It was a nationwide search.
Jan went with me voluntarily. They bring in aliens and mind washing.
The mission was that I was to have a child that would save the alien planet by the time I turned 16.
The Brobergs say the attacks still continue.
If you're laying a trap for me, I'll kill you.
His number one goal was to seduce Jan Broberg. And if he had to destroy the family, he would do it.
There'll never be anybody for me but Jan. Never.
All right, so that gave us a brief overview of what the film was about, or is about, or it actually the true crime documentary is about. It's set in 1970s. Robert, known as B, who's the perpetrator, got to know this family, befriended this family. They met in church, but his sole mission and goal was to get close to this family so that he could start a relationship with this child. Over the course of the documentary, it took about 2 years before he actually snatched Jan, or he actually had permission from the mom to take her horseback ride. And I thought it was quite interesting that he had about 5 children of his own, but he had a fixation on Jan. And as you heard in the trailer, his intent was to um, destroy the family if necessary so that he could uh, get this child. She was 12 when he abducted her, and for the first time, because he actually took her twice. He took about 2 years, like I said, to groom not only Jan but also the family. He would drug her and get her used to taking what he termed allergy pills. Take your allergy pills. On this particular day, he got permission from the mother to pick Jan up from her dance class to take her to for horseback riding. And as soon as she got in the car, he gave her one of her quote unquote allergy pills, which actually turned out to be sleeping medicine. He ended up abducting her while she was knocked out. He moved her from his vehicle to his mobile home or RV, drove to Mexico with her, had her there, um, brainwashed her to believe that aliens had kidnapped them both, and that her sole mission in life with him was to procreate. And so that's how the sex abuse started. She was missing for a little over 30 days before they found her. The FBI got involved and recovered her alive, and she went home. The During the 2-year period that he was grooming, he entered into a homosexual relationship with the father and a premarital sexual relationship with the not premarital um, sexual relationship with the mother as well. And they both were involved within a relationship, so he used that as leverage for them not to press charges once Jan got home. When Jan did return home, she was a married child. He had actually married her in Mexico. So the only stipulation that the parents placed on him was that the marriage, at this point, that the marriage be voided. And to avoid the shame in the community and the church, they decided not to press charges against him. And at that time, in about 1974, 1975, there were no laws enacted that would force him to be criminally prosecuted. Um, so I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on, but I just wanted to give you a background on what happened with this case. And I want you to pay particularly close attention to the signs that I'm going to be talking about. He showed, when I say he, that's B, showed as the perpetrator, and especially when we talk about the impact that it had on the victims. Quick facts. FBI statistics show fewer missing persons of all ages is down 31%. This was a study done between 1991 to 2011. Why are there fewer missing persons? Well, cell phones and Amber Alerts discourage crimes and resolve disappearances quickly. 4 myths about child abductions, and we'll review each of these a little more in depth. Myth number 1, more children are abducted by strangers. Myth number 2, more and more children go missing every day. Myth number 3, the internet has made child abduction easier. And myth number 4, prevention starts with teaching children to avoid strangers. Most children are abducted by strangers. Um, that's false. In fact, there's only about 1/100 of 1% of children taken that are abducted by strangers or slight acquaintances. The last comprehensive study estimated that there was about 115 in a year. While homicides and abductions are truly horrible, the cost of more missing children cases shouldn't be underestimated. Those cases number in the hundreds of thousands, and they take up a lot of police time and leave lasting traumatic scars on the victims as well. Myth number 2, more and more children go missing every day. That ties back in to myth number 1. That's not true. Many state missing children agencies show a declining number of cases. Cell phones, again, are a big help in um, summoning help and getting out of threatening situations. And over the past decade, we have become more and more aggressive about finding, persecuting, incarcerating, supervising, treating, and deterring sex offenders. Prevention programs and response systems such as Amber Alerts, and they both such as Amber Alerts and response systems both discourage and resolve crimes or disappearances more quickly. Myth number 3, the internet has made child abduction easier. The internet has indeed changed the way young people take risks. They do it more often at home. I work with teenagers in my therapy, and they have the World Wide Web at their fingertips. Anything you can imagine, it's there. It's open. All they have to do is tap, click, push, or whatever it is, and they have information at their fingertips. So they socialize and experiment more online. But guess what? That also makes it easier for them to meet people with bad intentions, but the physical distance and the time that elapses between the meeting, the becoming aware of meeting them online and actually being able to meet them in person um, helps to deter the crime from actually happening. So again, they have the ability to meet more people or socialize with more people online, but because of the distance and the time lapse, the crimes are actually easier to be prevented with the use of the internet. Myth number 4, prevention starts with teaching children to avoid strangers. We have all heard the term stranger danger, and that was the most widely used term of the past. Even in the documentary, Taken in Plain Sight or Abducted in Plain Sight, the FBI agent talks about how he was never really taught pedophile or how it was always stranger danger. And when this case came across his desk and he was assigned, how he found it extremely difficult to get involved with his limited knowledge, but I like some of the things that he did, especially with the family when they when they first alerted the FBI after 5 days had elapsed and she had been missing. They first alerted the FBI and they were like, "Oh, he's a nice guy. We know him for church. Everyone speaks highly of him. He's a business owner in the community." However, the FBI agent was straightforward with him. He's like, he's taken your child, and he kind of gave it to him straight with no chaser. So I love that aspect of it, and that's a skill or something that we all as professionals working with children and families will have to do when we don't want to, or the families don't want to deal with the reality that this trusted person has actually done something to harm them. So we shouldn't just teach them about strangers. We should also, or people who aren't strangers, but let's focus more on the behavior. Are they touching you inappropriately? Are they being overly personal? Are they trying to get you alone and withdraw you by yourself? Are they acting like they're under the influence of a drug or alcohol? Are they provoking others or recklessly wielding weapons? We need to teach children to practice refusal skills, disengagement skills, and how to summon help. And in its simple term, refusal skills are when children or encounter difficult situations. They should be taught things like resisting pressures or setting boundaries, saying no, meaning it, and leaving the situations. While disengagement skills, especially with teens, should include both verbal and physical interventions. Physical interventions can be something that we as adults learn, especially when we're working in the professions that we are working with. We are taught CPI training, nonviolent crisis intervention. Some of these skills can also be taught to children, especially teens. Younger children can be taught more of the no, go, yell, tell, and I do that a lot when I'm working with my smaller kids and we're learning about appropriate versus inappropriate persons. I actually do a hands-on exercise with them where we actually participate in an activity where we encounter strangers and we practice the no, go, tell the stranger to go away, you go as the child, run, yell while you're running, help, help, and tell a trusted adult. So those are all some key prevention strategies that we can teach our children in order to avoid being abducted. One of the major tools we like to use in the mental health profession, which has gained so much notoriety because of its effectiveness in the community that it was first tried in out in California, is the Adverse Child Experiences tool, and it's called for short ACEs. And basically, it's for children living through abuse, violence, and other traumatic events. They may suffer the ill effects for the rest of their lives. These life-altering events are called adverse childhood experiences. Research about the lifelong impact of ACEs underscores the urgency of prevention activities to protect children from these and other early traumas. When children do experience trauma, understanding the impact of ACEs can lead to more trauma-informed interventions that help to lessen the negative outcomes. Many communities are now exploring how reducing ACEs can help prevent child maltreatment and help gain healthier results for children and their families. ACEs is used a lot when you're first or when you're initially assessing a child and a family for services for mental health care. And it's a simple 10 question question. It's a 10 question questionnaire, asking about some childhood events and experiences. And if you score 1 point for each question, and if you score 4 or higher, you usually have some type of trauma that needs to be addressed in treatment planning as well as in treatment. So let's go over some of the victim impact, and I'm going to use my knowledge of the Abducted in Plain Sight documentary as a way to kind of make these more relatable for us. First impact is the child may have changed identity or a new name. So when Jan was first abducted, the first time, and taken to Mexico and married, yeah, there was a name change because now she was the quote unquote spouse of this abductor. However, that was erased, and she went home. She assumed a whole nother um, lifestyle from what she had grown accustomed to with the abductor in that short amount of time. But on the second time around, when he took her about 2, 3 years later, he actually moved her from Idaho and took her over to California and placed her in a Catholic school, changed her name, told the personnel there that he was a CIA operative or some type of law enforcement operative on secret assignment. The mother of Jan had been killed, and he was placing her in boarding school, or that Catholic boarding school, because he had to go back out and do some more government work. So he kept her that time for about 9 months, I believe, and he would go back and forth and visit her. But the entire time he had her, he was calling the family, mom and dad, saying, "Have you heard from Jan? I haven't heard from her." He would call them just about weekly, pretending that he was also missing her or searching for her. The child may go from a single child family to a new larger family. It was the opposite there. She went from a larger family to a single child family with just him and her at one point living in a mobile home as a couple, and then him sending her off to the boarding school. The child's school and grade level may have changed. We've already discussed her school changing. The abducting parent and searching parent may have different rules, expectations, and ways of parenting. Well, that's in that case, um, he was not looking to be her parent. He was looking more to be her mate. The returning child could have a new living environment. When she returned home after the first abduction, she isolated herself, kind of stayed to her room and kept to herself quite a bit. And she had 2 younger sisters who had previously shared a close bond with her. Well, that was no more. In school, she had changed and kind of withdrew. So her entire living environment had changed. Her perspective on the world had changed because, one, she was in love with her abductor at this point, and eventually, and then two, she was now living under the belief that the mission that they were initially told to carry out by the aliens was not complete. So she hid a lot from her parents, and with the intent of still, quote unquote, saving the world. The abduction can be an ongoing experience that changes the child's whole life. This all started with Jan when she was about 10 years old. And if you get an opportunity to view the documentary, you'll see 28 years later, she's still affected by what happened to her as a young child. She still talks about thinking about him every day. He even re-entered her life at one point where she had to file an injunction of protection against him for stalking. So this traumatic experience of abduction doesn't just end. Each child has to go through it in their own way, and you just go through the trauma with them. And again, the abduction is about the child and experience. This gets lost a lot of time because we want to focus on, okay, you're back home now. Everything is um, going to be like it was, but it's never going to be like this it was, because like the title of the book that the documentary is named after, Stolen Innocence. She was an innocent child when she left, and she came back with some experiences that only adults should have experienced, as far as the sexual intercourse and so forth. Continued victim impact. There may be developmental issues unique to abducted children. And you can see some children, and you'll see that a lot with trauma and in the mental health profession. Erickson used his stages of development. He's one of the theorists that used his stages of development to promote different um, milestones or stages in a person's life. And he often states, if you get stuck in a stage, if Jane was indeed stuck in her 12-year her abduction when she was 12 years old and never had the opportunity to receive the help she needed to grow and progress, then you would have to, as a mental health professional, identify developmental issues that are unique, especially to abducted children, and go back and help them process through that so that they can develop the coping skills necessary to continue to grow and be healthy, happy, productive members of society. The child may have been forced to grow up before his or her time. We talked about that. I can't even imagine being married at 12 years old and taking on the responsibility of saving the world because the aliens said I had to do so. So, um, yeah, there are some things that she took on as a 12-year-old that uh, the perpetrator exposed her to, that she should have never had to experience. The child may have missed out on birthdays, holidays, and school promotions. While the first time she was abducted was a short period to us, because there's no such thing as a short period of abduction, but for the purposes of this training, it was 30 days. And it didn't say much about her missing out on anything. However, the 9 months she was gone for the second abduction, she did miss out on holidays and birthdays and different things that the family celebrated. The child may feel like he's starting over. You'll see that a lot if you have an opportunity to view the documentary, where in between the first return from the first abduction and the second time she left, um, she felt like she didn't belong. I don't fit in here with my family anymore. She had fallen in love again with her abductor, and her whole mission was, I gotta get to him. So much so that mom eventually sent her off on a trip to go visit him because she was fearful that she was going to leave anyway. There is no continuum. The child may have been forced to assume a new identity. We talked about that. The child may be behind emotionally and educationally. It didn't show any or it didn't speak of any educational developments, but in the personal case that I talked about earlier, um, the 10-year-old who was almost abducted, she did, the grandmother in that case did report that the child was behind academically, had some educational as well as social development issues. The child may operate in survival mode, which means just what it says, I am going to do what I have to do to make it out of here. And this is more so when they're taken and um, they have the knowledge of being taken and they want to make it back home and be safe. Um, they'll do whatever they have to do to survive. And that can sometimes lead to uh, sex trafficking or um, stealing to eat or other things of that nature. The child may lose his childhood. In most cases, that is exactly what has happened, the longer they're gone, the longer the impact, or the harder the impact of them losing their childhood. Abnormal things may have become normalized. And in the case of Jan, abducted in plain sight, abnormal to the average person would be an alien abduction. An alien came down, abducted us, and told us that our primary or sole mission in life is to procreate, to save the world. And if you tell anyone about it, then your parents will be stolen and or killed, I'm sorry, and then she would no longer be available for the mission. He would take the younger sister would now have to fill that role. So while that whole story is abnormal, just listening to it being told on the screen, I'm like, wow. I mean, wow. But that was normalized for her. So even when she returned home, he would write her letters every day and she would write him back. And it would all be centered around their love and getting back together and fulfilling the mission. And that's what they termed it, the mission that the aliens had directed them to do. So again, I'm going to move right along past that because I think I've summed that up quite a bit in that Stolen in Plain Sight documentary. Um, as with most abductions, relationships, circumstances, and negative communications are some of the reasons why victims refuse help. So let's talk about relationships. Relationships with not only the perpetrator, relationships with the family members once they return. Everything has changed. Relationships have changed. I've fallen in love with my captor. I want to get back to my captor. Um, a bond has been developed. Even if it's dysfunctional, a bond has been developed. Circumstances. There may be circumstances where it is beneficial for the child to have some contact with the abducting parent or the abductor themselves, the abducting stranger. However, it's important to not the abducting stranger, excuse me, just the abducting parent. However, it's important to recognize that the child will have his or her own feelings about the abduction and the abductor, which may not be negative. And negative communication simply means talking poorly about the abductor may remind the child of the abductor and the abduction and make the reunion with the family members even more difficult. So let's talk a little bit about vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is also known as secondary trauma or compassion fatigue. Signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma include um, they resemble post-traumatic stress disorder and can include emotional, behavioral, and physical symptoms such as anxiety, depression, disturbed sleep, change in appetite, irritability, nightmares, loss of empathy, and numbness. Whereas treatment for vicarious trauma uh, would be basically examine your caseload and the availability of debriefing and grounding strategies. You may also need to assess the level of extraneous trauma images and stories that you're exposing yourself to in your personal life. If you have a lot of emotional symptoms, you may consider consulting a well-trained mental health professional such as myself. So I want to give a personal story about my own vicarious trauma as a mental health professional. I was working in hospice, and this was the first time that I'd ever worked with patients, medically ill patients. I'd never dreamed in a million years that I'd work in that arena, but such as it was. Um, Actually, one of the most fulfilling times of my life. Anyhow, I was initially stationed at an inpatient unit, and on my first week there, I'll never forget my first week as a hospice mental health professional. 9 of my patients died on me. And again, I'd never experienced that in my life, never worked around um, that type of environment. And I had 9 patients in a 5-day period die on me. So I did this day in and day out. I did a lot of praying and consulting with my colleagues who work in the arena, because I found out early on that people who don't work in that arena really don't want to hear your story. So I had to consult with other professionals. Um, I had to check myself and learn coping and grounding skills. And what really woke me up, though, was I was walking in my home and my daughter said to me, "You don't smile anymore." And that's when it hit me that I was having some vicarious trauma related to the stories and the people that I'd been working with. So as a professional, not only in mental health, but in law enforcement, and other agencies that work with children who are abducted or exposed to trauma, we have to be cognizant of how we respond and make sure we're taking care of ourselves, because it could easily turn into the anxiety, depression, disturbed sleep issues. Okay, so I'm going to jump a little bit and we're going to talk about preventative measures overall. Abducted in plain sight was um, started in 1974. That whole scenario started in the 1970s, and it took about 20 or so years for laws to be enacted that addressed um, that actually addressed the sex offender registration and community notifications. The perpetrator in the Plain Sight documentary um, only spent about a year in jail, and that was later on in life because 6 other girls had come forward and said he had done it to them. But for the most part, he was sent at one point to a mental health facility, and I believe he stayed there for 6 months before he was released. He had a psychiatrist or some mental health professional tell him at one point why he did the things he did and how to overcome his addiction to uh, young girls or children. So in 1994, the Jacob Wetterling Act was enacted, which required the states to register individuals convicted of sex crimes against children. Also, um, Megan's Law was enacted, which allowed the state's discretion to establish criteria for disclosure, but compelled them to make private and personal information on registered sex offenders available to the public. So this was in 1990s that these two acts or legislative laws were made. How has law enforcement failed? In a national survey, about half of the 17,000 responding officers said they always refuse to take a missing child report. And if the abductor is a parent, instead viewing it as a private family matter or issue for the family court. We talked about that a little early. In this same national survey, police officers even refused to write a report and stated that they quote unquote felt that a safer place for the children was with the other parent. If it was the dad or the mom, whomever was the abducting parent, the police officers would often state that what safer place would there be than to be with the parent. So they didn't look at the abduction by a parent as anything serious. What steps can law enforcement take to prevent child abduction? Some steps that they can take would be like reviewing, revising, and updating prevention policies that can coincide with the latest trends, and also educate both by receiving and providing information about warning signs or understanding warning signs that are associated with child abductions. And we'll look at that a little more. Prevention policies that law enforcement can enact includes the three-strike laws, basically, which has been enacted in most states. Where I know in the state of Florida, 3 strikes and you commit 3 felonies, you're supposed to be sentenced to long-term prison sentences, life in prison, if I'm correct. Speedy response systems, communication systems, and search protocols operate together when a child has been kidnapped, and all affected agencies should be notified and again working collaboratively. And nationwide effort was led by the Polycloth Foundation, which afforded all 50 states to now have an Amber Alert system put in place. So, and we're going to talk more, a little bit more. We'll dissect the Amber Alert system. But before we do that, let's understand some of the warning signs of family abductions. First thing first, if you have this kind person who is cozying up not only to your family, but you notice that there's an unusual affection for your child or children, you should always want to know, do they have a criminal record? Ask questions. Ask as many as you possibly can, because I would rather um, have more than enough than not enough information. 2, does the person have a history of marital instability, lack of cooperation with the other parent, or domestic violence or child abuse? Now you can pay for a background check on the web. I don't know how reliable it is, but those resources are at your hand. I know you can go in and Google just about anything you want and find out information about persons. 3, has the person previously abducted or threatened to abduct a child? What I didn't share, again, going back to the Abducted in Plain Sight documentary, after the child was abducted, then the neighbors and community members came out to say he had started, or the perpetrator had begun to um, developed these same type of relationships with 2 other children, which was promptly shut down by the parents. So he had a history, and then they even had the perpetrator's brother speaking in a part, and he said that his brother has always been a pedophile. They had a younger half sister that he used to mess with. He said that the younger sister was at the time 6, and the brother was about 12, and he would mess with her inappropriately. So they had all of this information about this perpetrator, but it didn't come out until after the fact. So everyone was being reactive instead of proactive by um, sharing this information. I thought it was quite alarming when, even after he abducted this child and she was returned the first time, he moved over to the neighboring state and opened up this family and child fun facility, sort of like a wet and wild type facility where the family can go and swim in the pool and hang out all day. So it just the entire documentary was kind of eye-opening for me about how it used to be, but we've come so far. Um, does the perpetrator, number 4, does the perpetrator have strong ties to a different state or country other than those that he currently lives? Um, Number 5, is the perpetrator unemployed, or can he work anywhere, or is he financially independent? Um, in the documentary, the perpetrator was financially independent, owned businesses, well liked, had access and had means. He had access to other vehicles. Case in point, his RV, where he moved them to eventually and started his new life. And does he have does the person have passports or visas? So means by which they can get out and travel and explore and roam and leave. There was a 10-year analysis done where it was reported or found that school was one of the biggest factors in the timing of when abductions occurred. 70% of the abductions occurred on school days. Trends that were found were that attempted abductions often occurred more so when the child was either going to school or coming from school. Younger children were more likely to be walking alone or with a peer, and their bus stop or residence on those days and other or to their bus stop and residence on other days. Force was most commonly used against younger children than older children. So I go back to the 10 and 11-year-old from my personal example, where the grandmother stated that the perpetrator jumped out of the car and attempted to forcefully grab both of them and put them in, and the 10-year-old was able to snatch her arm away and run and tail, where the 11-year-old unfortunately didn't make it. Verbal ploys were used towards elementary and middle school children. Um, in one of the Jacob Wetterling Act and the Megan Act, Megan's Law, Megan was lured away from her home by a neighbor who lived across the street, um, promising her to come and see his new puppy, and that's how she was taken. Children who got away either ignored, refused them, used their cell phones, fought, screamed, another child or adult intervened, or the child was able to leave the area. A study by the National Center for Missing and Exploiting Children analyzed more than 42,000 attempted abductions in February 2005 to March 2010, found that 38% of the attempted abductions occurred while a child was walking alone to or from school, riding the school bus or riding a bicycle. We just spoke about that. 72% involve female victims. When we talked about the statistics earlier, females are more likely to be abducted than males. And 63% of non-family abductions involve a friend, a long-term acquaintance, a neighbor, a caretaker, babysitter, or a person of authority. So non-family abductions involve these people who we are acquainted with, which also falls under stranger abductions. What steps can schools take to avoid child abductions? Because now we know that about 70% of the abductions occur when a child is walking to or from the schools. Um, they can implement child abduction prevention policies. They can do meaningful and regular trainings. They can conduct drills. They can have a better understanding of family law issues, especially when it's a parental abduction for custody reasons. Identification issues. I know I've gone into several schools. I go into them regularly to visit, and I can show my ID and I'm able to get in because they know me. I live in a small rural community and they know me, but I have witnessed others come in and they pull the list. If you're not identified on the list, I've witnessed them call parents and say, "Hey, I got somebody here trying to visit your child." Da 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 da. So that's identification issues, I think, has been a big one in the schools, and me personally, I've seen it um, be well addressed. And then last but not least, there should be training for students. There should be trainings on those signs that of identifying an abductor or a potential abductor, which I gave earlier, the means, the marital problems, the criminal records, and so forth. So those are some of the steps that a school can take to help avoid child abduction. Important tools for collaboration within the community. The Amber Alert system and the Endangered and Missing Advisory, also known as EMA. The Amber Alert is the program that began in 1997. So let's go back to the documentary that was in 1974 when this child was taken and reported 5 days later to be missing. They didn't have an Amber Alert system. They had to notify local law enforcement agencies, which actually notified a lot of the surrounding states, including um, Mexico, that they were indeed looking for this child who had been possibly abducted. So the Amber Alert began over 20 years, almost 25 years later after this case. Can you imagine the abductions that occurred within that time when the system wasn't in place? During the first 6 years of the Amber Alert program, the alert saved a total of 31 children. I think that's awesome. One saved is awesome. Amber Alerts are not issued for individuals who do not meet the criteria, and there are several criteria that need to be met in order for Amber Alerts to be enacted. Um, in these cases, agencies might consider developing and enhancing enhancing an endangered missing advisory, and the Amber Alert and EMA provides a strategy for law enforcement to notify the public and save lives. I'm sorry that I'm rushing a little bit, but in the interest of time, I want to go ahead and go through. So um, I do welcome you to search the National Crime website, and you can get more information about the Amber Alert and when it was enacted and so forth. But let's take a moment and look at the Florida Amber Alert system. As you can see, Florida has 67 counties, at least at my last count that I'm aware of. I know we've been hit by a few storms, but I haven't received any reports that any of our counties have been totally wiped away. But moving on, of these 67 counties, if you search this slide, you can see the different counties which were affected or received Amber Alert activations. And this was last updated in March of 2016. Um, the county with the most Amber Alerts was Miami-Dade, followed by Broward County, and then Palm Beach County. All of those are South Florida counties, heavily populated counties and high crime areas. And you can take a moment and go back and look at your county. There are several counties, some of the smaller, more rural counties, where there was only one Amber Alert enacted, and I don't see Highlands or Hardy County uh, listed on this chart. So that lets you know that those counties don't even show any Amber Alerts being activated. The EMA, which is also the Endangered Missing Advisory process, and I'm just going to briefly go through what it should look like. There should be established phone banks, which then lead to notification of law enforcement personnel, which notifies the NCMEC, and then prepare for the community reaction and response, prepare for the media reaction, determine media responsibilities, provide confidential phone and fax lines and email addresses to be used solely for the purposes of the child abduction Amber Alert activation, and then to review all activations after it's all said and done. Some important community agencies to partner with include the Missing and Endangered Persons Information Clearinghouse, which is also a part of the Amber Plan, the local law enforcement agencies, National Crime Centers, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and Child Abduction Response Team. So let's look at some of the agencies that law enforcement and other professionals can collaborate with. Some of the agencies, or case in point, the parents. First things first, we should never assume that a child is a runaway, even if we know they have the propensity to do so or a history of doing so. Every call, every case is new. Never assume that the child is a runaway. Take it seriously. Review the criteria to see if they meet the Amber Alert activation, and act accordingly. And then it would be helpful for not only mental health professionals, other community agencies, but especially law enforcement agencies, to use motivational interviewing techniques. Those are techniques used to elicit information while not blaming or being overly critical of what has happened, or what has caused the child to go missing, whether it's a runaway, whether it's an abduction. Just motivational interviewing techniques should be used. Um, it's important for law enforcement officers to collaborate with stakeholders and partners, representatives from law enforcement, the media, departments of transportation, and most important, the Amber Alert stakeholders should be working together to try and, if not prevent, to resolve an Amber Alert quickly. Emergency 911 centers, Attorney General's offices, emergency management personnel, and community-based organizations also play an important role in dissemination of information to the public. The media and the media's presence, not only the media that we know of, but also social media, um, play an important part in the collaboration of getting information out there. Broadcasters who enter in an agreement with law enforcement agencies to provide immediate response during Amber Alerts should be assured that their partner agencies will fulfill all of their responsibilities in accordance with the activation plan. And to sum it all up, I want to say thank you for your time and all that you do. And I hope that you are all more knowledgeable on the collaboration, um, ways to identify, educate others, and how to continue to work to prevent child abductions. I'll now turn it back over to Jessica.
Thank you so much, Rashida. At this time, I would check for any questions. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please just drop them in the questions panel. Looking ahead, I would like to invite you all to join us for our next webinar this upcoming Thursday, March 21st at 1 p.m., where we will take a closer look at child sexual exploitation. At this time, there are no questions, so I would like to thank everyone for joining this webinar. At the conclusion of this webinar, an evaluation will launch immediately on your screen, and a second opportunity to complete the evaluation will be emailed within 30 minutes. Just as a reminder, a recording of this presentation is available on demand at the Serving Children and Reaching Families site, as well as the YouTube site. Special thank you to the Department of Juvenile Justice for sponsoring this webinar, and thank you again to our presenter, and thank you, participants.